Okay, welcome back. And looks like this is the 12:30 normal regular Monday Zoom session, but it looks like no one is here with questions, so I'm going to go ahead and do the next lecture in Unit 5. I just did the Unit 5 lecture on the Renaissance, and so now we're doing the lecture on painting. Painting is, so as you're paying attention, you may have noticed that every unit has an art medium. Like drawing was the very first art medium for unit one, and then ceramics for unit two, and then um, sculpture for unit three, and architecture for unit four. And so for unit five, the art medium is painting, but it is also the art medium for unit six. Painting is the only art medium where we cover it twice. And the reason is because it just seemed like to cover like all the different kinds of painting and show you so much of what has been made with painting. The painting has been pretty ubiquitous through the history of art. It would just be a lot easier if I split it into two. So this first one is about the art mediums that are the oldest, the painting mediums that are the oldest, and then the next one would be about the more modern. So this one is going to be about fresco uh, and let's see, we're talking about fresco and encaustic, and then egg tempera. And then the next time in Unit 6, when we cover painting again, we'll talk about oil painting and watercolor, gouache, and acrylic. And I know it doesn't seem like, oil painting and watercolor are particularly, new, but in the history of human civilization, they're relatively recent. Okay. All right. And so before we start by, looking at, well, like looking at examples of fresco paintings and then looking at examples of encaustic paintings. Before we do that, we need to, um, and so in terms of like the testable material in this lecture, the definitions of what is fresco, what is encaustic, what is tempera are going to be the primary things you need to know from this lecture. But the other thing you need to know is just the basics of how paint is put together. Paint always involves using a pigment. Pigment is the, the ground material that makes the color. So to give you an example, if you have a tube of red paint and it says it's an earth iron oxide red, the pigment is iron oxide, which is literally rust. It is the rust of iron. And then you take that iron oxide, you grind it up into a powder, and then it becomes pigment. It can be mixed with things to make paint. If you prefer a brighter, less kind of earthy sort of red, then your pigment might be cadmium red medium. Now, different pigments, like different materials, like cadmium, can make a yellow, an orange, a red orange, which is called cadmium red light, cadmium red medium, and cadmium red deep. And they're all slightly different. They all come from cadmium, which is the same element, but they're treated slightly differently, like heat treatments and other kind of chemical treatments to bring out certain changes in their properties to change certain colors. Okay. Um, so that's the pigment. It is a powdered material. It can be organic. Trying to think of a good example. We don't really use organic much anymore, but we used to, like there used to be a paint called rose madder, which was literally from the grinding up of the pigments from petal leaves, right? Or a paint, there used to be a paint called geranium lake. They make a new version of it, but it's not the original geranium lake, right? So, or a classic one in terms of an organic pigment is Indian red, which was made from the grinding up of dried uh, cow urine. They would feed the cows exorbitant amounts of saffron so that their pee would be extremely yellow, and then they would distill it, dry it out, and then grind it up, and that would make the pigment for Indian yellow. Okay, so that's an organic pigment. But a lot of them are mineral pigments, so that could be things that are mined, like it could be clays. There's a pigment called burnt sienna, which is a natural earth, and it literally is the clay that comes from the region of Sienna. Now, today, if you buy burnt sienna, it's probably not actual clay from Sienna. It might be iron oxide mixed with a few things and a little bit of natural clay, but it could be from almost anywhere. Be from Alabama. Um, and so burnt sienna, so there's like that's a clay pigment, but it could also be mined like cadmium, right, which is a mineral that has to be mined, or like titanium white, which is made from the oxidation of titanium, but titanium is a mineral that also has to be. Okay. And then there are also things called synthetic organic pigments, which function like they're organic in that they use organic compounds, compounds that have carbon in them, but they are made entirely in the lab. And so if today you're painting, you look on your tube of paint and it says that the color you're using is naphthol red or dialoride uh, orange. These are colors that were just made in a lab with people just linking carbon up together in different sequences until they found one that makes a color. Okay, so that's pigment. So every paint has pigment in it. Every paint also has a binder and has a medium. Sometimes the medium is also a binder, like in the case of oil painting, but sometimes not. Sometimes the medium is also the solvent, like the thing that you use to make it thinner and thinner. So, like in watercolor, water is both the medium and it's also the solvent. The more water you add, the thinner it gets. But it's not the binder. The binder is a separate thing called gum arabic, which is mixed with the pigment. And without the gum arabic, it wouldn't mix with water. And in oil painting, linseed oil is the binder, and it's also the medium. The binder is the thing that sticks the paint to the surface. The medium is the thing that makes the paint fluid. So in oil paint, linseed oil is both the binder and the medium, but it's not the solvent, not really, because if you add too much linseed oil to it, it becomes hard to use. So you need something else like a turpentine or today sometimes artists would use like mineral spirits to thin it down a little bit. Okay. All right. So everyone needs to know the definition of pigment, right? Binder and medium, as well as maybe also the definition of solvent. Um, that could be an extra credit question. And then now we can start talking about the different kinds of paint. So fresco is painting into plaster. And there are a number of different techniques, and we're primarily going to be talking about the simplest one, which is where you paint directly into the wet place plaster and you do it once. So the simplest form of fresco is you lay down, you have a wall and it's already kind of plastered up to a certain level, but then you lay down your last layer of plaster. It might be as much as half an inch, maybe an inch thick. Um, and then while it is still damp, like it's dry enough that when you put your hand on it, your hand doesn't just make a handprint into it, right? It's dry enough, but it's damp enough that when you put your hand on it, it still feels a little bit cool and a little bit kind of wet, right? You're not like it's not mushy. You can't mush it around anymore. It's hard enough that it's set, but it's still damp enough that it's still water absorbent. And then you're working with pigments that are mixed just with water. You then start painting into the plaster. And so in fresco painting, the plaster itself is the binder because the pigments soak into the plaster, coloring the plaster itself. So it's not that it goes into like it's not just that it's sitting on the surface. It actually soaks in. Sometimes it can soak in as deep as like a 16th or an eighth of an inch into the wall, right? Which is why that you can clean frescoes relatively um, vigorously and still have color. But you need to be careful because there are other techniques that involve working with colors on top of the dried plaster. So you need to, so like I said, there are the simplest form of fresco is where you only do it once, but there are more complex forms of fresco where you do it multiple times. And so you can see like early in the Renaissance, right, like with Giotto, the techniques for how to work the plaster were a little bit more, um, they hadn't quite figured out all the kinks in the system, so to speak. So you can see places where they divided up the wall into sections. like we put plaster down for this area while we're painting this figure, right? We do that section all at once. And then, and then we paint that color. And when it was fresh and original, we probably wouldn't have seen any of these gaps or lines. It's only as it's aged that those have shown up, but those showed up because of the fact that it was painted in sections. Whereas here on Raphael, the technique for laying down the plaster and painting each of those sections was much more controlled. They did a very good job, and you can't see really any of the seams, so to speak. Okay, so the Sistine Chapel is probably the most famous fresco painting. I will say that the fresco painting that most likely shows up on the test is not going to be the Sistine Chapel. It will probably be the School of Athens, which is, I don't think, in this lecture. Let's just go back to the Renaissance lecture for a second. There it is. Okay, by Raphael, the School of Athens. That's probably the fresco painting that will show up most often on tests. Okay, but like I said, the most famous fresco is probably this Sistine Chapel by Michelangelo. And notice how clever he was in terms of designing this into very, very discrete, very chopped up into small sections, right? Each of these sections then allow him and his crew to plaster just small areas, do the painting in that area, then plaster another small area, do the painting in that area. These are like slightly bigger, and this is probably the largest size areas, and they had to probably do this in sections. But a lot of these could be done in small single go sections. And yeah, and so I think that as I mentioned in the lecture, the art historical lecture, Michelangelo was actually known more notable and more thought well of as a sculptor and as an architect, and was not considered like one of the greatest painters of the Renaissance by his contemporaries or by the artists who came immediately after him. But I think one thing you can definitely say is that the Sistine Chapel shows an immense, like a fantastic sense of design, trying to figure out how to solve the design problem of how to cover this entire ceiling and to do it in a way that feels kind of consistent with the architecture that's already in the space, and that also feels, that it will allow him to solve it with a fresco section by section. It was very clever. And here are some examples of fresco painting um, from the 20th century. Here's a Diego Rivera. So encaustic, like I said, the three painting mediums that we're talking about for this unit are the three oldest. Fresco is the oldest that we have, going, as far back as ancient Egypt and ancient Minoan fresco paintings. And to a degree, you could say, because kinds of almost like plaster-like materials, like chalk hatching, was used in like the cave paintings in like Chauvet, you could make the case that there is something fresco-like about those cave paintings. But another really old painting method is called encaustic. And in encaustic, you paint with wax, but the wax has to be heated up. So it's like, very, very hot, like boiling wax. And then you mix the pigments. You don't have to do anything special with it. The pigments mix evenly in the hot wax, and and then you paint with it. But it's immediately, as soon as it cools, it starts to dry. So it dries very fast as you're putting down a mark. So you have to make kind of like loose, quick kind of marks, right? Just or you have to kind of like embrace the kind of the choppy and paint and kind of the the materiality of it, because it could get really built up. In this particular case, these three are all examples of what are called Fayum portraits from Egypt during the Roman occupation period, right, when Egypt was a Roman province. And these are all funerary portraits, right? These are kind of like what the Egyptians of this period did instead of doing um, like a carved sarcophagus head. They would have a coffin, and then on the over the head, they would then kind of mount these panels painted with the portrait of the person who had passed away. And these are especially, we're not exactly sure why, but they're especially common for young boys and young men. Um, so most likely people who died unnecessarily died at a young age. And so we have more of them for that than for anything else. And then here are some examples of 20th century encaustic. This flag painting, whoops, by Jasper Johns is a, and you can see with Jasper Johns what he's doing. Let's see, is really he's emphasizing the physical nature of the encaustic, how it gets really built up and it's very thick and sticky and kind of like it's a kind of a chunky sort of surface. And he's embracing that, which is kind of different from these artists who were trying to come up with every possible technique to hide the the encausticness of the encaustic. Here's a brilliant piece of Jasper Johns' Three Flags piece, which I think is really amazing. And here's some contemporary artists who also work in encaustic. And then the last one I'm going to talk about, like I said, these are the three that are the most ancient, is called tempera painting. And tempera is painting with egg yolk as your binder. And tempera painting is important in part because it's been used for a long, long time and is still used today. But it's also especially important because without the tradition of tempera painting, we wouldn't have the tradition of oil painting. It was only through oil painting or through tempera painting that we developed and figured out oil painting. So here are some examples. Now, the Madonna and Child has a lot of gilding, a lot of gold applied to it. So it's a little bit harder to see all of the tempera painting. But the thing about tempera is it's kind of similar in a way to encaustic, which is that it dries pretty quickly. And once it dries, it's not, you can't manipulate it. You can't blend it. You can't re-wet it. So artists learn to work in a very kind of like a tiny kind of hatching line, right? You build up values by hatching and cross hatching. Um, and you can kind of see that in the detail here on Cassandra Wyatt painting. Here's a 20th century example of tempera painting, right? And it's made, this whole skin, right, is all made up of these lots of tiny little marks, hatching and cross hatching in different directions, lights and different values and different colors, in kind of following the contour and building up the head that way. And and that's really the same. I mean, this technique is a little bit more stylized and a little less colorful, right? In that, like, this is mostly just value organization going on, like here in this passage. Whereas if we really look at like all the changes of temperature and color that are going on there, it's pretty amazing. But it's basically the same technique. It's working with a tiny little brush and it's working hatching lines, cross hatching lines back and forth again and again. Here's another artist, a contemporary artist who works with tempera. This is Andrew Grassi, and I love this piece. I like his work a lot in general. And so the last thing we need to talk about is how did tempera painting lead to oil painting? And so one of the things to understand is that the tradition of tempera painting, by the time we get to the late Gothic, both in Italy, but especially in Northern Europe, the tradition was to seal tempera paintings with layers of kind of like an oil varnish. You would take like linseed oil and a damar resin or some other kind of like tree pitch resin that would help that oil dry to a real hard shell, right? Like a shellac. And then you would brush that over the painting and that would protect the painting. It would protect it from light, although they didn't really know that would do that, but it does protect it from light, from the UV damage. It's caused by UV radiation. It protects it from cracking. It protects it from the damp, right? From the weather. Remember, these people lived in buildings that were, not air conditioned, didn't have any kind of, heating other than fireplaces. So the paintings would, be easily damaged by changes of humidity. So these get varnished, and somewhere along the line, the artists start to realize that they can add color to the varnish, right? They can add, and then make layers of paint of like these kind of oil varnishes that have a little bit of this embedded color in them that can maybe darken certain areas or they can make the colors a little bit richer. And it's through that eventually we're not sure who, but probably either Hubert or Jan van Eyck figured out that you could, if you really wanted that pigment to mix with that oil completely, what you needed to do was you needed to grind it, right? If you grind the pigment into the oil, you can force it to bond with the oil molecularly. And so, like literally, if you take a cup of linseed oil and you mix in a pigment, let's say iron oxide red, into it, and you stir it with a spoon, it's going to mix a little bit, but it will settle out very quickly, right? So if you tried to make stains with that, that color is not gonna be permanent, and it's going to cause kind of technical problems. Whereas if you take that same amount of iron oxide pigment and you add drops of linseed oil in it, and then you grind it with a glass grinder called a muller, you grind it on like it, and just press really, really hard, you're going to push that pigment into the oil to such a pressure that you're going to make it bond. And so now the paint is no longer a suspension where like the stuff sits in the liquid and then eventually settles down to the bottom, right? That's the definition of a suspension. Now you have a solution, right? Where the pigment, no matter what you do, is always going to stay in the same proportion to the liquid. Okay. And that makes oil paint. All right. And we will probably talk about the Arnolfini wedding multiple times. And okay, the only other thing I want to talk about is I have like maybe a second is I want to pull up, where was I? I want to pull up this lecture right here. So earlier I'd spoken about the paper. I will be talking about the paper a lot tonight and in the review session tonight at 7 o'clock. I'll be going over the paper and I probably will be going through this particular set of images. And I had mentioned that there are videos available on the YouTube site where you can see me kind of talking about this comparison, also talking about other kind of comparisons, like similar kind of comparisons between two paintings. So the comparison painting is to look at these two paintings and compare them purely formally, not in terms of content, not in terms of which what they are saying, but just purely formally. And so to see them clearly in terms of how they are dissimilar or dissimilar in terms of form, it helps to, like, let's say, look at them purely black and white, and you can much easier see the value organization between the two, right? You can see that the value range of the two of them is relatively the same, but there are other aspects of the value conscious being much greater in the Rubens. And if we can look at them blurred, and that helps us to see just the overall organization of shapes, especially if you can look at them upside down. See how like when we're looking at this upside down, we really see this whole shape much more as a single shape, all these lights combined together because it's harder for us to read the figures in them. More blurred still. And then here are some views of like just showing you kind of like where all the major movements are, where the geometry and page organization is. Also, looking at it in terms of like chopping it up gives you a much greater sense of how there's so many much more light and light mid values in the Max Beckman and so many more dark values in the Rubens. Also seeing them really zoomed in helps. So I will share this, send this as both a PowerPoint and a PDF to all of you so that you can use this as a resource to help you really look and look carefully. And like I said, there's a page here where I explain all the different ways that, now it says down at the bottom, number 11, some other comparisons. That's actually in a separate lecture where I think it's the one titled Comparison Practice. And this one, oh, this one has all those and that's comparison practice. Well, there you go. So it has like comparisons like these. Okay. Anyway, that's where we're going to end. So hopefully tonight there'll be a lot of people there and we can discuss the paper and make sure everyone is on target for doing the paper. All right. Thank you.